Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cliona Cunningham. I am Director of Public Affairs and Communications with Cement Europe, and it will be my pleasure to moderate the event today. This event actually is being organised as part of European Sustainable Energy Week. So we're very pleased to have over 350 participants registered today. So I think that's a great reflection of the interest in this topic and the relevance of it. We also have a great lineup of speakers. So we're going to have perspectives from industry, policy, infrastructure, and the wider climate community. Now, just a quick housekeeping point before we start. You will have an opportunity to ask questions. There is a Q&A. So please feel free to already start putting them in writing in the Q&A. And we will get to those after the panel discussion. So I think we're all aware that decarbonising Europe's hard-to-abate industries require a clear and coordinated approach to industrial carbon management. Now, for the cement sector, that of course is of particular importance because 2/3 of our emissions are in fact process-related and unavoidable. So this means that CCUS is essential. In fact, if you have read our roadmap, which I hope you have, it clearly sets out that 43% of the sector's decarbonisation pathway will be catered for by this. So the ambition is clear, but there are still significant challenges, and we will be discussing those today. Now, before we move to our keynote speaker, we would first like to hear from you, our audience. So we have a quick poll for you, which should be appearing on your screen. There we have it. So the question is, what is currently the biggest barrier to scaling CCUS in Europe? And you have a number of choices there. CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, permitting timelines, funding and de-risking, regulatory clarity, or market uptake and demand. So I see the answers coming in. At the moment, we seem to have a slight preference in CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, but also funding and de-risking is, no, regulatory clarity, yes. I think that's still going on. CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. Okay, some interesting answers coming in there. I see the numbers are still changing, so we'll wait a moment before we move on. Now, I think our speakers are going to be touching on all of these points, of course. Yeah, I think that's clear. CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. Perfect. Okay, thanks, Pada. Great, so it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Eva Hajdukonis-Sadowska. Eva is Director of the Department of Innovation and Energy Efficiency at the Polish Ministry of Climate and Environment, where she oversees work on industrial decarbonisation, including the development of national strategies for CCUS and hydrogen, as well as energy efficiency and the decarbonisation of transport. And she also brings with her a lot of experience from the European Commission and from her work in Brussels as a diplomat. And she has a very strong background in EU policy across climate, energy and agriculture. So Eva, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for your invitation. I'm truly pleased to see such strong interest in today's topic. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, today I would like to briefly share with you the perspective of the Polish government administration on industrial transformation. I will refer to 3 fundamental points, namely the need for stable industry, the commitment to transformation, and the importance of pragmatism. Firstly, for us, maintaining stable cement production capacity in Poland is not just an economic issue. It is a matter of a strategic importance. Cement is the backbone of infrastructure development. It is essential for housing, transport networks, energy infrastructure, and for broader economic growth. But it is also increasingly linked to resilience in terms of the ability to build and maintain critical infrastructure domestically without relying excessively on external supply chains. Therefore, one of our priorities is to ensure that cement plants operating in Poland have competitive conditions for investment and development. And as a part of this effort, we are advancing work on CCUS by developing a legal framework for this technology and by preparing a long-term strategy for the development of the sector. We believe that maintaining an attractive investment climate is essential. The cement sector in Poland is a strong example of constructive cooperation between industry and public administration. And by building on this, we will continue to work together to support conditions that enable the industry to operate effectively, invest, and remain competitive within the European markets. Secondly, maintaining industrial capacity does not mean preserving the status quo. We want to transform, and actually we must transform. This transformation has two key dimensions. First, reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with European climate objectives. And second, strengthening our independence and reducing exposure to external risks, including energy and raw material dependencies. A central mechanism driving this transformation is the EU emission trading system. The ETS was designed to create a gradually increasing carbon price signal, encouraging investment in low carbon technologies. And this logic remains valid. But we also recognize that reality has proven to be more complex than initially assumed. The pace of industrial transformation has been, in many areas, slower than expected. And this is, of course, not due just to lack of ambition, but rather to real constraints, such as geopolitical, financial, and infrastructural. We therefore need to take this into account when shaping our approach to industrial transition, both at national and European levels. And this brings me to the third point, namely pragmatism. We need to be honest about where we are today. We need to clearly identify barriers, whether they relate to geopolitical risks, infrastructure gaps, financing, or regulatory complexity. And this is precisely why cooperation with stakeholders such as you is so valuable. Industry and public administration must work together to ensure that our strategies are grounded in reality and aligned with actual implementation capacity. As you know, a significant share of emission in cement production are process emissions, which are inherently difficult to eliminate and require still developing technologies such as CCS. The pace of transition is also constrained by high investment costs and regulatory uncertainty, including the evolving design of EU ETS and CBAM, which affects companies' ability to plan and finance long-term decarbonization projects. The upcoming ETS revision should recalibrate the linear reduction factor to avoid an artificial scarcity of allowances after 2030, which could lead to excessive cost pressure on EU industry. A more realistic trajectory is needed to reflect investment cycles and maintain competitiveness. The EU should maintain and slow the phase out of the allocation, especially the sectors exposed to carbon leakage, as the decarbonization options are not yet fully available. Free allocation remains a key instrument to preserve competitiveness while enabling investment. The ETS must ensure stronger market stability and more predictable carbon pricing, including reforms to the Market Stability Reserve. Stable prices are essential to avoid disruptive cost shocks that weaken the competitive position of EU industries. And finally, the system should be strengthened by additional flexibility mechanisms, including the use of high-quality removals and international credits, as well as robust financial support, such as Modernization Fund. This is crucial to keep the transition economically viable and competitive across the Union. And additionally, CBAM must be linked with a temporary continuation of free allocation under the EU ETS, preventing double carbon the transition. It should also be complemented by continued compensation of indirect carbon costs, given the strong exposure of cement production to energy prices. So if we accept these 3 points which I mentioned, so the need for stable industry, the commitment to transformation, and the importance of pragmatism, then several conclusions emerge. First, carbon pricing under the ETS must continue to provide a strong incentive for decarbonization. However, it must do so in a way that encourages investment rather than discouraging it. A price signal that is too abrupt or disconnected from technological readiness may risk delaying investments rather than accelerating them. Second, we must address an issue that has been widely discussed in recent years, so the evolution of ETS prices compared to earlier expectations. A few years ago, many scenarios assumed a faster increase in carbon prices. The fact that the increase in carbon prices seems to be slower than expected created some uncertainty, including questions about whether technologies such as CCUS are still necessary. From our perspective, the answer is clear. Yes, they are. CCUS remain an essential component of industrial decarbonization, particularly for sectors such as cement, where process emissions cannot be eliminated otherwise. In fact, the slower than expected increase in ETS prices can be seen as an opportunity. It reflects to some extent the reality that CCUS projects are developing more slowly than initially planned. Infrastructure is not yet in place, regulatory frameworks are still evolving, investment decisions are still being prepared. So in this context, a more gradual ETS trajectory gives us time to close this gap. We are moving more slowly than we are originally assumed, but we are not changing direction. CCUS will be needed, and our efforts to ensure a balanced and realistic carbon pricing trajectory are fully complementary to this objective. So let me conclude, but by underlying one key message. Industrial transformation, especially in hard-to-abate sectors, is a complex and long-term process. It requires alignment between policy, technology, and investment cycles. And from Polish perspective, our approach is guided by 3 simple principles: maintaining strong industrial capacity, pursuing transformation, and staying pragmatic. So thank you once again for the invitation, and I wish you a very productive discussion. And before I close, let me apologize that I will not be able to stay until the end of the webinar and participate in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you very much for joining us this morning and for giving us your perspective, which is greatly appreciated. We do realize you need to leave, so thanks for joining us, but we understand that your colleague is with us, Elspeta Piszkos, and she will be here to answer any questions in the Q&A. So audience, please feel free if you have any questions regarding Eva's presentation, feel free to put them in the Q&A and her colleague will answer those. So thanks very much. Thank you, Eva. Goodbye. Right, so now let's get started on our panel discussion. So I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers. We have Rob van der Meer, Industrial Policy Director here at Cement Europe, where he leads the sector's engagement on EU climate and industrial policy, and he brings extensive experience from within the cement sector. We have Susanna Selles, Policy Officer at DG Energy, and she's working on EU policy for CO2 infrastructure and industrial carbon management. And we also have Jens Erfurt, Technical Project Lead for CO2 transport at Open Grid Europe, with over 20 years of experience working on carbon capture and infrastructure. And finally, Toby Lockwood, Director of Carbon Management Practice at the Clean Air Task Force, where he leads international work on the deployment of carbon capture and storage and is closely involved in both EU and UK discussions. So good morning to you all, and thank you for being with us. Now, Rob, if I can get started with you, you've been working on this issue for quite a while. Perhaps you can delve a little bit deeper into what it means in practice. And I believe you have a few slides that will be shared.
First, hard-to-abate. Cement industry is, and it was mentioned also by Eva, is having the problem together perhaps with the lime industry that we are really a hard-to-abate sector. Really to go down to zero means at the end that you have to do something with the process emissions, not substituting that with other materials, but you really have to do carbon capture. And that means deep carbonization. That means significant investments. That means significant OPEX in order to achieve zero emissions in 2050. Our roadmap, the Cement Europe roadmap, identified these challenges, not only for the carbon capture, but for all reduction technologies, because we need everything. And that brings me to the point that I wanted to highlight. We have, after the roadmap that we updated in 2024, we prepared a cement action plan, identifying what is needed in Europe on to decarbonize our sector. And you see that on the slide on the right. There are 4 points in our cement action plan that need immediate action, and that was in end of 2025. And it is aligned to the topics that were in the poll, to be honest. First, adequate funding, including robust public grants, including de-risking value chains. That is important. The key point is that the current CO2 price, the current EUA price, doesn't bring the business case in view. We really need additional funding. Otherwise, there is simply no possibility to come up with deep decarbonization or decarbonization in general of the cement industry. That's not nice because you are dependent as sector from a public good. That is not nice, but it is essential to have this done before 2050. Deep decarbonization of the sector means starting, in fact, already. Today is too late. We should have started earlier, but for that you need a business case. Second, and that was mentioned as the top priority in the poll, infrastructure. We need the CO2 infrastructure. The CO2 that we capture, that we will capture in our cement plants all over Europe. There are now 200 cement plants, and I will come back on that in a minute. That 200 plants will capture CO2, and that CO2 is to be transported to geological storage sites or to sites where the CO2 can be used for other projects or for mineralization in construction industry. That CO2 infrastructure is needed, absolutely needed, and we need it fast. And when I'm talking to cement producers somewhere in the middle of Europe, and they talk about that they will get a pipeline in 2038, 2040, that means that their deep decarbonization, it cannot start before that. That's late, very late. Important in this discussion is there should be a trigger for really having low carbon products in the market. And for that, the governments, the national governments, regional governments, the communes do have a role to play. They should buy low carbon products, not only cement, but all low carbon products. That will cost some additional money. But if the public procurement is only oriented on the lowest price, then the trigger for decarbonization is coming not from the government, apart from a push question on permits. The last point that I wanted to highlight is, and it's not the least important, it is important, is the question, what about the workforce? Our cement sector will change completely. It is in transition from an energy-intensive industry to a part of the chemical industry. The carbon capture plants will be more chemical-based than cement-based. And we had yesterday a discussion on that the chemical basis of these plants is complex, but still the cement process is also complex and also in the future. What does it mean for today? We need today the funding, the de-risking. You need the regulatory stability, but also the permitting possibilities, not having a permit for a capture plant in 10 years' time, but faster, without hampering the input from stakeholders. And I would like to go to the next slide. I hope you can see it. It is a slide that I stole from the European Commission, and I'm hoping that Susanna is not using it, but perhaps Benzi is using, she can give the comments. One of the issues is what I mentioned, the issue of the CO2 infrastructure. And we are waiting for the legislative proposal on the CO2 markets and the infrastructure. That will come, I think, very soon. Perhaps Susanna might say something about it. But it has to address the barriers to a cross-border transportation of CO2. Because when you are in Austria, the geological storage is today in the North Sea. You have to cross the border. Perhaps we have to cross the border to Norway, or to the UK, or to Egypt. Now we get the big slides. Thank you, Bade. We have to have, of course, a competitive, cost-effective CO2 value chain. That's important. How to arrange that is a key issue. The oil and gas companies will play a major role in it, in allowing CO2 capture and storage at a reasonable price, not at a big price and not at a higher price. We have to look at the value chain, how they can be aligned, but also that we have the permitting possibilities, that the grid, that the CO2 infrastructure is permitted in time. And the last one is, of course, that investors should have confidence in what's happening. And from that perspective, I really want to focus a little bit on the de-risking elements of this discussion. The point is really, I was talking yesterday to someone from Cementir. They got yesterday the confirmation of a significant funding by the Danish government for their carbon capture and storage facilities. Beautiful, but they need 160 permits or 168 permits for that. 168 permits. Think about it. It is impossible. We have to align that. That is for transport, that is for the capture, that is for the building, that is for everything, but 168. But they also have to take care of the de-risking of the value chain. They are responsible for the CO2 that they produce, but they are now in that system also responsible for the transport and for the storage. And if something is not functioning in that system because the storage perhaps is later or transport later, then they still have to pay. So that's an important one. I want to conclude positive. So that's the next slide. And the positive message is in the cement sector, in our Cement Europe group, we have in total 124 projects aligned. And you see them in this map that we have also on our website. 124 projects in 21 countries, not all the countries yet, but they will come. And interesting is that these projects range from deep decarbonization, carbon capture, but they also are focused on other types of measures to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, alternative fuels, clinker substitutions, new cement types, name it, energy efficiency. It's all covered in these 124 projects. Not all need the instruments that we are discussing for this session, but for the hard-to-abate elements, the process emissions, that is especially the deep decarbonization with carbon capture and the infrastructure and the alignment and the value chain, all that is in it. But the positive message is we are going to do it. In fact, we are doing it already now. Please help us. That was my input. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was extremely interesting. You've touched on a lot of points there: funding, workforce, business case, de-risking, permitting. And it's nice that you could finish there with a positive message too. After hearing you, I'd really like to go to Susanna now and kind of get the Commission's perspective on that. How, Susanna, you see the role of CO2 infrastructure in Europe's decarbonisation and competitiveness agenda.
Thank you very much, Creona, and good morning also from my side. I'm very happy to be part of this webinar today and have the opportunity to talk about the work of the European Commission in the Directorate General of Energy on the CO2 market and transportation legislative proposal, which Rob already outlined. So I have an easier job, but no worries, Rob, I'm not using the slides, so we are compatible. So just to recap a little bit, in 2024, the European Commission published the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy and the 2040 Impact Assessment. And both documents confirmed that we do need carbon capture, utilization, and storage to reach our climate goals. And the Impact Assessment itself was very clear on the ambition. So around 2050, we would need to capture and store more than 500 million tons of CO2 per year to reach the climate goals. So this is a very high ambition, and clearly the reality is rather bleak. There are very few operating projects in Europe, even less projects taking final investment decisions in the EU. Of course, on the positive side, we see the projects developing, for example, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Italy, in Greece, but this is not sufficient to reach our ambition. So as the speakers before me already mentioned, there is existing EU legislation supporting the development of the industrial carbon management value chain, most dominantly the ETS scheme, and it's important to mention that indeed our colleagues in the Directorate General for Klima work on reviewing and reforming the ETS framework. At the same time, the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy also proposed that we develop a regulatory framework for the development of a well-functioning internal market for CO2 and CO2 transportation. And that is what we are currently working on in DG Energy. And on the timeline, right now we are working on the impact assessment, and the proposal, the legislative proposal, will be published by the Commission before the end of the year, likely in November. Now, in a nutshell, in 1.5 minutes, more or less, I will tell you what we would like to address with this proposal. So what are the challenges and barriers we identified, and what are the possible measures to address these? So there is an overarching challenge, because when we talk about these markets and the infrastructure, we talk about something which hardly exists. So we have to start almost from the scratch, and this means that the regulatory framework have to, at the same time, first of all, provide flexibility in the ramp-up phase to allow projects to develop. But at the same time, it also have to provide long-term regulatory certainty, because that is what will guarantee investment in the sector. Within this framework, we are also looking at more specific topics. So you had the pool, and we discussed already, we need infrastructure, transport and storage infrastructure in place. And this will also require some sort of planning tools to ensure that we know how much infrastructure we need, when and where in the EU. On the other hand, when we are able to plan the infrastructure, it will also mean that emitters and storage operators will have the information on when infrastructure will be available. And coordinated this at the European level will provide the necessary transparency and investment security. Also, we have to remove any existing barriers to the development of the infrastructure. I don't need to go into detail after Rob about permitting. It's an issue we have to address and simplify permitting procedures. Also, we would like to provide regulatory clarity about how we can reuse existing but not used energy infrastructure for the transport and storage of CO2. Another topic which already was mentioned is also very important for us. If we have infrastructure, when we have infrastructure in place, we have to ensure that there is no barrier to the cross-border transportation of CO2. And these barriers are currently of legal character, stemming from international conventions, but also technical issues have to be agreed across the border, for example, the quality of the transported CO2. We would like to create a well-functioning market and operate it in a most cost-efficient manner. Measures we are considering here is to further detail the third-party access rules. So the aim is to ensure that all emitters who need access to the infrastructure have access to the infrastructure based on transparent, non-discriminatory, and equal rules. And finally, again, something which was already mentioned, we need to increase investor security, investor confidence in the market. So we are looking at increasing transparency. What is the demand, what is the supply, what are the costs and the price of transportation, for example, and de-risking measures for the for the ramp-up phase. So in a nutshell, this is what we are working on, and I'm happy to answer any questions in detail. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Susanna. Let's take the infrastructure perspective now. So Jens, I'm going to turn to you. What does it actually take to develop a CO2 transport network in practice? From planning right through to operation?
Yeah, maybe just a few words about OGE. OGE is the largest German natural gas pipeline operator with a network of more than 12,000 kilometers and 100 years worth of experience in planning, building, and operating pipelines. We are currently branching out into two sustainable business models. hydrogen and CO2 transport. And the business development for CO2 transport is based on hard-to-abate emissions. So that's lime, waste incineration, and of course, cement. Right now, the situation in Germany is such that we are only starting the discussion on storage projects in Germany, and that means that our focus as a pipeline operator, planning a backbone for Germany and capturing all the hard-to-abate emissions, our focus is at the moment on cross-border connections. So we are involved in projects with Gasunie in the Netherlands. We are involved with Fluxys in Belgium. And the general idea and the focus of the business development is to export the CO2 to these countries and then possibly further on. What we are currently doing is route planning for these parts of the backbone that would enable to transport CO2 from the west of Germany in North Rhine-Westphalia, high emission density there, to the Netherlands and to Belgium. And that means route planning, that means preliminary work to gather all the information that we need to file for permission ultimately. But we are not at the stage yet where we have an FID. And that means simply that currently there is no business case. I would argue that the degree of coordination cross-border in these projects that you need is limited. For example, when you do the permitting, once you have a legal framework in place in the respective countries, that can well be done separately. Gasunie are applying for permissions in the Netherlands. Fluxys is doing the same in Belgium. We are doing so in Germany. There is a limited need for cross-border coordination, I would argue, on a technical level. The need for CO2 specification, Susanna already mentioned that. That is one important technical issue, but other than that, permitting, for example, that can be mainly left on a national level once the overall legal framework for the European domestic market is in place. What we're currently lacking, as I said, is a business case. In some countries that has been successfully addressed in the UK and Norway, you see a high degree of national integration, and there you have value chains built up on a national level that seem to be working, and the state has had an important role in that. Our situation is such that not all the value chain, at least for the time being, will be within Germany. So that would mean that we need to make sure that we need to make FIDs, synchronized FIDs, all along the value chain for the emitters, for the infrastructure operators, and also to some degree for the storage operators. And that needs to be synchronized now, not just on a national level in specific member states, but also across borders. And that is where we are right now.
Thank you very much, Jens. So yeah, currently a lack of business case and need for synchronization. Toby, I'm going to turn to you now to get a more broader perspective. It'd be great to get your viewpoint on this.
Hi, yeah, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Yeah, I'm in a little bit of a noisy area, but it's great to be here. Just introduce Clean Air Task Force. We're a climate NGO, and we are working on developing technologies and policies to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We have a team working in the US and in Europe and Africa, and industrial decarbonisation, cement decarbonisation, and CCS deployment have all been key focuses for us, both in the US and Europe. And I think, I think Europe has a positive story to tell in this respect. We've had some positivity from the other speakers. I think I can add to that. Lots of challenges facing this sector and this technology in particular, but Europe is leading the way. We have, of course, one operational large-scale CCS cement plant in Norway. another final investment decision in the UK, and lots of large-scale projects in advanced stage of development. I think we have a lot of project tracking and funding tracking and infrastructure tracking on our website. You can go and have a look. I think we have over 30 CCUS projects in the cement sector, just to drill down a bit into the map that Rob presented. So that's really promising. And I think what's maybe even more promising is that a high proportion of those projects in Europe have received quite significant funding. I think there's around 17 that have funding through the EU Innovation Fund. And there's a few others that have received funding from national schemes, like we heard about the Danish plant, which has Innovation Fund money and recently received Danish money as well. So I can talk maybe a bit more about the challenges that still face those projects later, but I think in comparison to other regions we work in, it's very positive. The US is often held up as a leader on this technology, and there is a lot of CCS, I would say, momentum in the US, and some important incentives which still exist in CCS in the US, despite a kind of rollback of some climate policy which we've seen under the current administration. There's still a tax credit available for storing CO2. Unfortunately, this isn't the only solution which is needed for cement decarbonisation in the US, because the tax credit is not enough to cover the cost gap for cement plants, which have quite a relatively high cost capture process. So, cement and other heavy industries in the US were really looking for additional funding on top of that tax credit. And while some of that was available under the previous administration, there's significant uncertainty now about whether some of the first mover pioneering cement CCS projects in the US can access those funds, such as demonstration funding and grants. And you can find an analysis of that, the status of that funding on our website if anyone's interested to look into that. But my overarching point is that I think Europe is leading the way on this, and it can be in a really strong position if it carries that momentum through to get FIDs on more of these projects which are in an advanced stage of development across the region. There's some really interesting projects in that list of Innovation Fund cement projects that have relatively straightforward access to infrastructure. It's more challenging for some of the plants that Jens just talked about in inland Germany, but coastal plants, ones which are close to planned storage sites, there's definitely some low-hanging fruit there which we can use to build the momentum that Europe's established and become a pioneer for developing really low carbon cement. And I think, as was touched on earlier, there's clearly a value to putting low carbon cement onto the market, and we need to use policy to create that value and ensure that there's strong demand from the construction sector to really valorize that. So yeah, I probably used up my time allocation, but happy to delve into any more of those topics. And
no, I think that's really great, Jens, Toby, and I think we can delve into some of those topics in the next round as well. But I think that my takeaway is hearing that Europe is leading the way, so that's very positive. But I think there are definitely some points that we could go into a little bit further there. So thanks for that. Now, before we go to the next round of discussion, and by the way, I see there's plenty of questions coming in, but Rob is being very efficient in answering them, so that's great. We're going to launch a little word cloud now, so we're going to hear from you. We'd love to see your view on that. So the question is, in one word, what must Europe prioritize to make CCUS investable? So please put your answers in there. I think it's going to be really interesting. That's great. I see people are answering there. I presume at the end we're going to see a nice little word cloud. It's been interesting to hear about the number of large-scale projects that are at advanced stage of development there, and the role of the Innovation Fund. Some interesting points have been brought up. Just another few seconds here. Okay. Okay, I don't think we see the word cloud. But perhaps we'll come back to that. We may be having a technical issue. Yes, I think we're having a little technical issue there about it because we seem to see. Oh, perhaps it's hiding behind us. Aha, yes, indeed. It's not in presenter format, but we see it. Let me see if I can look. We have frameworks, infrastructure, CO2 funding. So many of the things we've heard about here: de-risking, price, regulation, support. Of course, that's been talked about a lot. Business case. That's I'm surprised that's not bigger actually. Demand. So yeah, a lot of the points there that have been discussed already. So that's really interesting. Okay, I think we can move on from that, and we can get back into the panel discussion. So Rob, if I can come back to you actually, what are the key uncertainties you would say that are still preventing companies? We've heard, about the lack of final investment decisions from a number of speakers. Although there are a lot of large-scale projects, being in the running, but there's a lack of FID. So what would you say is the main challenge in there regarding funding, de-risking, permitting, and so forth?
It was also a question or an point made in the question and answers saying infrastructure, that is the first priority. I can't help it. It is not a single answer. So the technology is an issue. So carbon capture, when we are talking about decarbonization, the technology is not yet optimized to the perfect solution. So that's one. Second, the infrastructure. If there is no infrastructure, no carbon capture, or you might have carbon capture, but you can't do anything with the CO2. The business case is fundamental. Infrastructure is fundamental. Business case is fundamental, because if there is no financial trigger to do it, whatever trigger that is, funding, public procurement, perhaps an increase of or whatever. If that is not there, then it can't happen. It is not a voluntary issue to decarbonize. The investments are too big to play. It is really a business. The legislation, permitting. I was talking to one of the plants yesterday, and for having a permit for carbon capture, you need 5 to 10, perhaps longer. Yeah, okay. Let's start now, and you have a plant operating in 2035. Simply all that, it is the package, to be honest. It is not a single answer. I can't help it. If it's a single answer, we should have done it already yesterday. We should have done that all. But if it is a single answer, then we go to DG and say, do something on that infrastructure. And then it's done, and we can say, okay, fine. Or we go to DG Klima, do something on the CO2 price. Okay, they increase somehow, done. No, it's all. And that's the complexity of it. The real point is we have to transition, we have to transform. I'm talking too long, sorry. We have to transition the sector. It's a fundamental change from the current or the old-fashioned practice of the CO2 emitting to practice where we have to go to zero. Now, that change is a very complicated change. And at the same time, we have to produce cement because there is a demand. Now, that challenge, how to do that, and together with the governments, together with the stakeholders, together with the neighborhood, I have no clear answer. There is not a single answer. Sorry.
Okay, understood. Okay, well then, Susanna, I'm going to look at you. Yeah, a lot of challenges just outlined there by Rob, particularly permitting, too many, too long. Love to get your perspective.
Thank you. But I generally agree with Rob on outlining the complexity of the issues we are facing. Permitting is clearly an issue we are looking at. There are different initiatives and different permitting frameworks. If transport project manages to become projects of common interest or mutual interest under the TENI legislation, then it has a different permitting framework. Under the Net Zero Industry Act, we have shortened procedures, but we would like to look at it in a manner which is complex manner and see how we can improve the processes, whether we can fast track the permitting procedures, a one-stop shop approach that you don't have to run to different authorities to get the permit. Of course, one of the big issues which we would like to address, but it remains mainly with the member states to do so, is provide the capacity, the person who is working in the ministries on the permitting, because this is an issue. And then coordination in the member state, but also among the different ministries and different authorities, but also across borders. We heard from Jens that this is an issue. So infrastructure operators do what they can, but we have to support them in ensuring that also the authorities and the member state representatives cooperate across borders to look at these projects not as national projects, but as cross-border or even regional infrastructure projects where we have to align how the permitting is addressed.
Great, thank you very much for that. Okay, so one-stop shop approach for permitting, coordination in member states. Jens, from the infrastructure operator perspective, how do you see it? What would you say are the biggest bottlenecks?
Basically, it boils down to de-risking in whatever shape or form. I'm dealing with technical issues mainly in my daily work. So far, I would say that we can resolve technical issues and keep the timelines. But the de-risking, it doesn't really enough shape, let's say, at the moment, what that could be. That being said, de-risking can come in many forms. We are agnostic to that. Maybe to just give you an example from the recent past, I mentioned earlier that we are also involved in hydrogen infrastructure. So that is something that has been ahead for some years. So hydrogen pipelines are at a more advanced state. We are now in Germany starting to operate hydrogen pipelines, other operators as well. And one of the challenges that we had to overcome in that respect is it's a general characteristic of pipelines that first there is a relatively large upfront capex investment, and then once the pipeline is operational, you have a relatively low OPEX over a relatively long time. But that also means that you need de-risking because we have to make all these investments upfront. Now, the solution for that problem in Germany, at least, was a so-called amortization account. So you have a public bank stepping up, giving some guarantees, and then we as an operator can pay them back later, decades later, from the grid fees, the transportation fees that we get. The way this was done, it's something that works in principle, to be sure. But the way that this was done is that there is still a distinct difference between how this is done for our established natural gas network and our hydrogen network. And that means that if the hydrogen transport volumes don't scale up over the next 15 years or so, there is a risk for us as an operator that we might have to get a lot of these credits, give it back. So that's a risk as an investor. Unlike many other pipeline operators in other member states, OGE is not a state company. So my suggestion would be, if you look at schemes for de-risking, look at these details, let's say. Don't make sustainable technologies financially less attractive than your established fossil business models. I think the reasoning behind that was that it cannot be expected for consumers of hydrogen to pay larger grid fees than for the fossil fuel, but it also means that there will be no significant or not the kind of ambitious investment into sustainable infrastructure. And we are seeing the same issue again now with CO2 pipelines. You might even argue that this this upfront investment problem is even more pronounced, because in the case of hydrogen, 50% of the pipelines that we are going to take into operation for hydrogen have already been built. That's for repurposing. In the case of CO2, we need to build everything from scratch. So that is one thing where you need to look at the details, and you need to make sure that the general incentives are right.
Okay, thank you very much, Jens. Toby, if I come back to you, you've already touched upon this now. You've said that Europe is leading the way. And you've touched a bit about the US situation, and maybe you want to go a little bit deeper on that now, things we can learn, or where we're ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think something the US has done well historically is this infrastructure development. There's been a number of large federal funding programs to support, in particular, CO2 storage development. So really supporting the early stage geological characterization work through things like the Carbon Safe program, and taking potentially large CO2 storage areas to from early stage of development through to a commercial project, in some cases with a significant federal funding. There was also a program under the previous administration to help support kind of oversized, future-proofed CO2 transport infrastructure. I think that's no longer available, but it was definitely an interesting idea, and I guess kind of tries to address the de-risking question, which Jens touched on there. And I think we would agree that in the European context, something like that, amortization account or some form of intertemporal cost allocation would be an important thing to look at for CO2 infrastructure, potentially under this forthcoming market regulation. That's the central challenge facing any kind of high upfront cost infrastructure, which is going to only really see a full use over a number of years. I think we can learn lessons even from successful projects that have taken place in Europe. We've seen a couple of very notable infrastructure projects. Well, there's the Northern Lights project in Norway, which is now in operation, and the Portals project under construction in the Netherlands. And I think an interesting characteristic of those is that there was a lot of state involvement, but they start with something which has an anchor project, or in the case of Portals, a few anchor projects where you have a few emitters who are committed to that infrastructure, but the infrastructure itself, particularly in the case of Northern Lights, can take CO2 from many more capture projects. So I think if you have funding to get something which is affordable, although those projects were not cheap, and you have one or two initial users to support that infrastructure, but the infrastructure itself can be more widely used and help decarbonize other emitters in the area, then that's, I think, a useful model which Europe has taken on. I think to make that work, you need a lot of coordination, and I think we need better, in particular, better coordination between the funding instruments we have available in Europe. And in Norway, that was solved by just the government kind of covering that whole project, including the emitter. But in other parts of the EU, it's complicated. You have some money for infrastructure through the Connecting Europe facility. You have some money for capture projects, the Innovation Fund, some money for storage projects through the Innovation Fund. You have these national funds as well. They're not very well coordinated at the moment. I think a real big problem to solve is making sure that when we dedicate money to a capture project, it has a real viable infrastructure solution that is also receiving adequate funding for everything to proceed together, or vice versa. And hopefully through things like the Industrial Decarbonisation Bank, which is also under development now at the EU level, that could be a great platform to deliver that kind of really coordinated infrastructure and capture project funding.
Okay.
And I guess I would also say we need to make sure we concentrate that sufficiently on projects that are actually going to get over the line. Because at the moment, as I touched on earlier, there's quite a lot of funding going to many projects, and that's great. But I think none of them are quite able to get over the line yet. So let's make sure we can get some flagship projects across the line.
Okay, coming back perhaps to the pragmatism that was mentioned by our keynote speaker. Excuse me. Okay, Rob, I'm going to come back to you today now. So you've mentioned a number of the challenges, quite a few of the challenges. Would you say, and if you would say, what would you say is the biggest? Is there something of a disconnect between the political ambition and what's actually happening on the ground?
Thank you for this question. That's really funny. Yes, there is a disconnect. We have a huge ambition, also as Cement Europe. The transition to a zero CO2 society in 2050, it is obvious that will cost money. Someone has to pay. It is not someone, everyone will have to pay. And on the one hand, no one wants to pay, obviously. And on the other hand, we have to do a huge transition. And that will mean that also for local people near a cement plant, but also near a CO2 pipeline, perhaps we need we need an extension of the electricity grid, not only for cement, but for many other purposes too. All that means the society has to change, will have to change. And it is not just a matter of putting down an ambition, which is coming from the European Commission, to say it easy, zero 2055, whatever in 2040. The reality is something else. Just to imagine and to make it clear, we are talking about the ambition for the EU in 2040, and the member states and Parliament and the Commission agreed on 90% reduction in 2040. Nice. We can do, according to our roadmap, 78%, not more, in 2040. That's the maximum. And I would say that is really very ambitious. Now, how to solve this? How to solve this disconnect between that what is the ambition, that what is coming from us as a realistic but very ambitious timeline, and on the one other hand, the situation that the regulation, that the funding, that the cross-border issues, that the infrastructure, the energy grid, the permitting, all that is not in place. So yeah, there is a disconnect, and that has to be solved. That is the reason we drafted, now perhaps to explain, that is the reason we drafted the Cement Action Plan, to highlight what is really needed. That is not something that we get for free. It still is needed to achieve that carbon neutrality in 2050. And any delay means at the end, more higher ambitions for the intermediate time, or perhaps not reaching the target. Now, not reaching the target is for me not an option. It's for us as cement industry not an option. So thanks for the question.
Okay, that's quite
and
clear.
I would like to hear from others what they think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's turn to
perhaps he can't say.
Well, let's turn to Susanna actually and see what she can say.
So what is missing, or what is needed to gap the bridge the gap between ambition and and the reality. So one element we did not discuss so far, and it's important for us, but it's not necessarily something we can ensure from the European Commission perspective, is onshore storage. So most of the storages we see developing or operational are offshore storages. And it's clear, and it's important to remember that the decision to allow and support storages, be it onshore or offshore, is a member state decision. And it's clear that member states are more reluctant to support onshore storages. What we can do from the Commission side with the work currently undertaken, and what I think also the industry and the stakeholders can do, is show the impact, the cost impact of such decisions for the whole industrial carbon management value chain. It's clear that developing and operating offshore storages is more expensive than onshore storages. And also, if we rely only on offshore storages, then we will need much more transport infrastructure. And putting this infrastructure in place will be costly, and the transportation cost for example, cement industry will be much higher than reaching a closer by onshore storage. But we also understand that when you talk about onshore storage, then it's related to the public acceptance issue. And here our possibilities again a bit limited. This is more a local issue or a member state level issue. So how to ensure that you provide benefits to the local communities, this is a local issue. But we also look at what the EU added value could be. So how to ensure that we provide a platform for member states to exchange lessons and learnings and best practices on communication campaigns, for example. So this is an issue which, as I said, we cannot solve just alone as the Commission or with the proposal, but we count on the effect of these discussions, which are currently running in the preparation of our proposal. And once the proposal is adopted, then we will start discussions with the members of the European Parliament and with the member states. And I think this will also raise awareness for them.
Thanks for that, Susanna. Toby, I see you're keen to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say very briefly on onshore storage and a plug for a tool on our website which compares the cost of transport and storage for emitters across Europe. And I mean, yeah, the message is clear. If you allow onshore storage in that model, then the average cost of transport and storage is more than halved. It's definitely, we see that as a really promising route to reducing the cost of these projects. And there are onshore projects proposed in Europe. There's several in Denmark. There's 4 in Denmark to be precise, and a handful, I'd say, you know, if you include even ones at the early stage of development, there's about 7 in Central and Eastern Europe. Interesting point there is that they're often led by the cement industry, you know, individual cement plants in Central and Eastern Europe. They're having to do their own work on this, identify local storage options and advance those independently. So I think cement's leading way on onshore storage, and it's a real prospect in many parts of Europe.
Okay, thanks for that. Jens, I'd love to get your perspective on that now. Onshore storage, a local issue, a member state issue, lack of public acceptance. What would your viewpoint be on that?
Yeah, obviously that would be helpful. The numbers, it is a lot cheaper. It is a lot more attractive, of course. At the same time, I would say, let me come back to something that Toby said earlier. First, get some flagship projects over the line. This was actually something that was echoed when I was on a conference last week, and there was a gentleman from the Norwegian Ministry of Energy on the panel, and he was asked about his lessons learned about the Longship project. And the most important message that he had was pick winners. So that is something that I think we should do for the moment. What we currently see in Germany, I mentioned that earlier, the discussion on storage is starting, carefully starting, and it's starting with offshore storage. And based on the experience that we've had in Germany on CCS some 20 to 15 years ago, when we first talked about CCS in a completely different context, that was about capture from coal plants. We did have that discussion in Germany on onshore storage. And that was part of the reason. I think people pushed too hard, and at some point the whole thing was politically dead. So I would be very careful to push too hard now, because we are only seeing that in a different context and with offshore storage and with hard-to-abate industries, that the topic is gaining traction, and there is now a good chance that we are going to gain the social acceptance that we're going to need to actually build and operate the infrastructure. I would say don't push too hard. Wait for experience from the projects that are now starting, and then some years down the line, we will be able to demonstrate that CCS is safe and can also move onshore. I'm very much looking forward to the kind of how things are going to turn out in Denmark. As I said, in Germany, we have not had a positive experience with that. In other countries like the Netherlands, there are similar cases. I think this should be done in parallel. Work on these flagship projects, get something done, and then when this is working, scale up.
Okay, that's clear. Don't push too hard. Toby, anything you want to add on that?
No, I think great points. And yeah, I think it's worth highlighting that the Danish cement project that was mentioned earlier, which just received funding, that is to an onshore storage site. So yeah, that could be the first to go ahead in Europe. Okay,
thanks for that. I'm going to look at the Q&A now. There's been quite a few questions coming in throughout the session, and many of them are answered. Excuse me. So I'm just going to have a look. I see here one on permitting. A question, why exactly does it take so long? And could we elaborate more on that? Why is the process so long? How could it be streamlined? Rob, do you want to address that one?
Yeah, the permitting is an interesting one. Also mentioned by Susanna about the one-stop shop, which is a nice intro. But in fact, perhaps we have to think about a one permit system for significant changes in the sector. But anyhow, I was talking to the Aalborg people in Denmark, and they need for their carbon capture value chain, including storage, including the pipeline, onshore storage, they need 168 permits. 168. That is a permit for building something. There's a permit for pipeline. There's a permit for changing the installation. A permit for safety. A permit for environmental issues. An environmental impact assessment. And name it, it is in. And it's not a joke. Now, what is the point is, of course, all these permits are important. And I don't want to say we should skip them. That is not the purpose. We should keep them, or perhaps we should integrate them, I should say, in one set of permits. Because it can't be that a permit for a building is blocking the whole building of a carbon capture plant, or that one neighbor having a rightful complaint about a pipeline blocks the pipeline, but also the storage, but also the capture. It is too important to have that assessed all individually, all the stakeholders' arguments, all the environmental impacts, whatever impacts in one place for each topic itself. The transition is for the whole sector, or for a cement plant. It is a transition from a traditional cement plant to a new type of plant without CO2 emissions, with much lower environmental impacts, but with a higher electricity demand, with a higher CO2 transport demand from 0 to 100%. So it is a significant change, and that can't be done by permitting just one permit at a time. I can't help it. So it's incredibly difficult, and more difficult is to come to that. The Commission says that for this major size of projects, perhaps a permitting time of 12 to 18 months should be the limit. Nice. But drafting a permit, setting up all these things before needs sometimes already 5 years. And after that you have applied for the permit, give it 12 months, beautiful. that doesn't solve it, because people will go to the court. And then we are 5 years sometimes along the line before we have a decision. So permitting preparation, 5 to 10 years. Permit limited to 12 months, 18 months, beautiful. If that is feasible, good luck, Commission, to convince the countries, but also to convince the regions and the communes to do that in 18 months and to assess it. But I think it's needed. But then we still have the long time for after the permit has been granted, before it is really finalized. So there is a whole package needed for that. But that's another discussion. For me, it's one of the things to be done, but it's not, it's not one of the 4 that I mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Another question, why can't we repurpose existing pipelines to CO2 transport? The questioner asks, what can be done? Jens, I think I see you typing an answer there. Do you want to share that?
Okay, I might just as well tell you. Generally, it can be done. You can repurpose natural gas pipelines, for example, to CO2 transport, but only CO2 in gas phase at relatively low pressures. Fluxys is doing that, for example, on a relatively large scale in Belgium. In Germany, we have decided not to do that. That does not mean that we are ruling out gas phase transport. For individual cases, individual projects, especially if there's a pipeline somewhere that can be repurposed, that can completely flip the business case. That might be the best option. But the natural gas pipelines that are available in Germany midterm for repurposing have already been earmarked for hydrogen transport some years ago. And given the kind of distances and transport volumes that we're looking at in Germany, that was also something in favor of a new built dense phase backbone, because dense phase transport is more efficient at larger volumes and distances, both in terms of CAPEX and OPEX.
Okay, thanks for that. I see permitting is quite a hot topic here. I see another question on that. Rob, I see that you would like to answer that. So the question is a single permit.
The question is, when we are talking, what I propose to have 1 permit, nice, thank you for taking this up. And the question is then, should the European Commission grant that permit? I don't think so. That is too much, because let's be honest, that is not a thing that the Commission can do. But the Commission has to arrange that it can be done either on national level or on regional level. And for permits of cement plants, that is always already now, for the major permits, not all, regional. So the authority that grants permit is now region. I can imagine that for big transition projects, including CO2 infrastructure, including CO2 storage, the country has to take a role. Perhaps together, I hope together with the communes and the regions, why not? They have to be involved. It is not that the Commission should overrule all the countries, or that the countries should overrule the regions, or the regions should overrule the communes. They are all part of this system that we have to set up for the transition.
Okay, that's clear. Great. Okay, then I think I'm going to ask a very short final question to all our panelists. Very shortly, what would you say is the single most important priority to ensure CCUS deployment happens at scale in Europe? I'm going to limit you to a couple of words. We'll start with you, Rob, as you're on the screen. So, single most important priority, if you had to choose a couple of key words to ensure deployment at scale.
There is not a single word and not a single issue that solves it. Sorry for that. It's a complete package. It is about infrastructure, about energy, about permits, about public procurement. I can't help it. Just mentioning one is underestimating the complexity.
Okay. Well, you can mention more than one, so I think you've mentioned a few there. Susanna, from your side, if you want to pick 3 or 4 measures that you think, feel free.
Thank you very much. And yes, I feel like Rob. I cannot mention one, but it's easier for me because I can mention that for us, clearly the priority is now to develop this legislative framework for the transportation of CO2, because we believe that this will help us, will not fully solve it alone, but will help us to put the infrastructure in place in the coming decades will allow emitters to have access to this infrastructure in a cost-efficient manner, and will also increase investor security. We heard today many times that regulatory certainty is necessary. Again, this is just one part of the picture we are working on. ETS is the other part, for example, or CBAM, but at least on this part, we would like to provide regulatory certainty.
Perfect, thank you. Toby, a couple of words from you?
Yeah, I mean, partly because we haven't touched on this too much and there's been a few questions on this, I would say I don't think it's the whole solution, but I think a very important piece is demand side mandates, like the Industrial Accelerator Act provides. A few questions on that in the chat. Yeah, we need to ensure that buildings have embodied carbon limits, and also maybe extension of the public procurement mandate for low carbon cement procurement, which is in the Industrial Accelerator Act, needs to increase and go beyond the public sector.
Okay, that's clear. Jens?
Yeah, first, I agree with Rob. Lots of building bricks. We just need to get all the ducks in a row. Yeah, what I said earlier, I think it's crucial to synchronize FIDs. So that means in our case, for example, that we need 10 to 20 large emitters before we can build a pipeline that collects all that CO2 and exports it. Synchronize your FIDs across the value chain. Let's say a dozen emitters, several transport operators if you're going across border, and then of course one or more storage sites. And yeah, you need to synchronize that. It has been done on a national level. It remains to be done between member states if the value chain is cross-border. There will be lots of regulatory things that will be important in that will be helpful, each to some degree. Susanna mentioned the ETS, she mentioned CBAM. I might add CDR. If we could incorporate CDR into the ETS to some degree, because especially in the case of cement, or even more in the case of waste incineration, there will be biogenic CO2 to some degree. That will be helpful to improve business cases. And CDR, for example, played an important role in making Longship bankable. So, yeah, lots of things to consider.
Thank you. That's a really good summing up. And I'm going to finish up by quoting you as well, because I like the image you've given. Lots of building bricks need to get our ducks in a row. So I think that's very much something we can close up with. So I would like to thank all our panelists and our keynote as well for joining us today for the great discussions. I'd like to thank the audience as well for all the excellent questions. Those that have not been answered, we will do our best to get to them as well. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for the interest in this, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our next events. So thank you.